If we can't remember where we are, it's been a while. But we are in Acts chapter 26. Acts 26. The Apostle Paul has had a rough time. It's happened for several years. He walks out, there's a Jewish mob, chapter 22, confronting him and wanting him killed. It's so much so that the chief captain had to save him. But before he walked into that building, he got to turn around and had the opportunity, and blessed opportunity, I mind you, that he got to preach in front of the Jewish mob. Okay, everything was great. He defended his faith. He said, I believe the same thing that you believe. And then he went on and talked about Christianity and so on, and yet they were angry at him. So they brought him into another situation in chapter 23. And this is where he is in front of the council, the sect, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, defending himself again. Now remember, Jesus had told him to speak boldly. Why could he speak boldly? Anybody remember what was promised to him? He'd be all right, and that he was going where? He's going to Rome. Okay, so he knew from the events between then and in Rome, he's going to survive. He's going to be fine. So he's going to speak. He's going to have the words given to him, and he speaks. And then so he's in front of the council, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Everything was going great for the council, except that Paul brings up what? To believe in the resurrection, but they were ready to kill Paul. In fact, they plotted to kill him. And so his nephew tells Paul, and Paul tells him to tell the chief captain their plot. And then now he's on his way out. And so in 24 of Felix, who also the Jews brought forth towards them, and all these things, but not convinced. Now there's some verses here that I want us to look at just as a review. Going to verse 23 in chapter 24. This is where should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or come unto him. So he had some liberties here. He could preach to whoever, and anyone could come to him for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And he reasoned of righteousness. No, that's not what happened. He trembled. He trembled, and then he said, Go thy way, for this time, when I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. So, again, we hear a common excuse for today. You know, I see what you're doing there with the truth. You're showing me that, and I see what God says about the matter. You know what? I'm going to wait till I'm more ready before I will, when it's more convenient for me, if you will, before I do any types of obedience. But Felix, nevertheless, he was a greedy man. He wanted to make sure that he knew Paul had money. He came in through to Jerusalem after the third journey, had all this money for those who were suffering, and he hoped that Paul would pay him to set him free, but that never did happen. So Felix kept Paul for how long? 2 years. He delays it for 2 years. If you will, Festus, and he goes in front of Festus, and then in the middle of the chapter, after he gives his spiel, Festus still wants him to go to the council to no means or no reason to. It was against the law. He wanted Paul to freely admit himself to their judgment. But instead of going to their judgment, what does Paul say to Festus?
Let's go to Caesar.
Yeah, I appeal to Caesar. Okay? So now Festus has a bigger problem. He has a free, or not a free, but all he did was make a bunch of Jews mad, okay, which wasn't against the Roman law. And so now he appeals to Caesar, which, by the way, we should point out that Paul had a right to do that because why? He was a Roman, okay? He had a Caesar. And so Festus speaks to Agrippa, and then Agrippa said, you know what, I'm pretty curious about this whole thing. So right here, Paul is going to begin his defense before Agrippa. First 3 verses. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. Speak for yourself, you're free to do so. Then Paul stretched forth his hand and answered for himself, I think myself happy, King Agrippa, I am accused of the Jews, especially because I know thee to be an expert me patiently. There's some reasons why Paul is glad here. Okay? He's got an opportunity, first off, to speak freely. He has that. What did he say? He said, I know that you know the customs of the Jews, you know their religion, you know what's going on here. I beg you, please be patient with me as I go through this spiel here. So he knew Agrippa was acquainted, could possibly discern the situation. Okay? So there it is. He also knew the differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees here. Verse 4. My manner of life from my youth, which was at the first among mine own nation at Jerusalem, know all the Jews which knew me from the beginning, if they would testify that after the most straightest sect of our religion, I lived as a what? Paul here is of the highest sect of the religion. He's defending his case here. All right, this is my background. And so he lived as a Pharisee, which is the strictest sect of Judaism. Paul McGarvey said this: the Pharisees were the least likely of all the Jewish sects to be unfaithful to Jewish institutions. That's important here. He points that I was a Pharisee, the one sect in this religion that would least likely to become unfaithful. It was therefore much in Paul's favor that he was able to call even his enemies to witness that from his youth he had lived in a strict discipline of that sect. It was yet more so to say that he was still a firm believer in the leading doctrine of that party, and to reiterate the assertion made on 2 former occasions that it was on account of the hope of a resurrection that he was accused. What is this hope of the resurrection? Well, let's continue on. Let me read further in the note. Let's go to 1 Timothy 1, 13 through 15. See, he was a Christian now. He was a Pharisee. He's a Christian now. He could find little about this part of his life. Now, the hope of the resurrection is a part of that. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's why I'm confusing myself anyway. But that hope, that seed promise is what? That's a hint. What is the seed promise? And who was it given to? Before the Jews, who was the father of all of them? There he is, Abraham, Genesis 12. Okay? So he's a believer of that. He's among that. But anyway, now that he's a Christian, there's his background. Now that he's a Christian, look, this is what he talks about. Let's read 13 through 15, somebody.
Who was before a blasphemer and a persecutor, and endured obtained mercy because I did it ignorantly and unbelief. And the grace of our Lord is exceeding abundant faith and love which is in Christ Jesus. This is a faithful saying and worthy of all expectation that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief.
Okay, did you see what he called himself in those verses? A blasphemer, a persecutor. He was injurious, and he obtained mercy, right? Why? Why did he obtain mercy in that? That's it. Yes, he did it ignorantly. Okay? Now, why did he do it ignorantly? What does that mean? It's a lack of knowledge. Okay? It's really not an insult. Somebody can have a tone of disrespect by using that word, but when it comes to being ignorant, rocket science, I'm completely ignorant of rocket science.
He had to be taught.
He had to be taught. That's exactly right. That's a very good point. And he was doing those things. Why was he doing those in the first place?
Because he felt it was right. In fact, if Christianity wasn't what it was, it would have been his duty to do something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because, that's a very good point. I'm glad you said that. He was a Pharisee. He had letters from the chief priest and permission to go around about putting Christians in prison, to persecute them, to compel them to blaspheme, all these things, because he was a Pharisee. That's why he did it. And he did it because he thought he was right. So his point here is to show Agrippa that he still believed that in the resurrection. In fact, I'm following the demands of this sect, and that's what I used to do. And so he still believes, and Agrippa knows that. He has that knowledge. This is not some stranger who just wants to come in and he's curious and wants to be entertained by what Paul has to say. It's not like that. He understands this. All right, let's go back to Acts 26. Begin at verse 6. And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers. That's where I was getting ahead of myself. Unto which promise our 12 tribes, instantly serving God day and night, hope to come. For which hope's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused of the Jews. Agrippa knows this. Why should it be thought a thing incredible with you, that God should raise the dead? So he's affirming here that it was on account of his belief in the hope of the promise God made to the fathers, which, Genesis 12, 1 through 3, that seed promise. All nations would be blessed. The 12 tribes derived, all beginning with Abraham. Okay? And so Genesis 12, 1 through 3, Lord gives Abram a promise, tells him to get out of the country, get away from your father's house, unto a land, I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I'll show you. And of course, because Abraham heard God's word, he obeyed it. So he heard it, believed what God said, and obeyed it. Faith, obedience, salvation. Okay? Faith, obedience, salvation. And then he promises him, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I'll make you great. You will be a blessing. I will bless them that bless thee, curse them that curse thee, and shall all families of the earth be blessed. That seed promise, Genesis 12, 1 through 3. So, there's that. Agrippa, this is what I believe. And that is not different from what the Pharisees believed. The problem with the Pharisees is they hated Christ. That's the problem. Okay? They refused to believe who Jesus was.
And the reason behind that is, well, twofold. One, they were more looking for an earthly king. And number two, Christ is not going the way they wanted them to. They wanted the people up, all the time.
That's exactly right.
Power, and they were much blinded by that, which really kind of pulls in that verse where sometimes God puts us over this strong illusion. Their desire for what they wanted, and even throughout history, what they wanted, deluded them so much. And I said, okay.
Yeah, it blinded them. Certainly did blind them. He said that they didn't believe in Jesus because, number one, they were looking for an earthly king, and that's certainly true. And then also, not only that, and I kind of think of if an earthly king did come, I wonder if they would just throw him out, because they also loved the favor of the people. They loved, hey, look at me, watch me pray, watch me fast. And then they were sitting in the high tables. They were wearing the fancy clothes. And they're losing the people because of Christ. So there's all kinds of things here. Absolutely. Now, the hope of the promise is the resurrection of the dead. Verse 8. And the ultimate aim of that promise is, when it's fully realized, is the resurrection, which ushers the redeemed into heaven. There has to be a resurrection. Okay? The Sadducees hated Paul. Why? Because he preached the resurrection from the dead. But he correctly perceived this be the main reason why there's a dilemma here. Okay, the Sadducees wanted dead. And so he raised a rhetorical question, why it should be a thought to be incredible that God should raise the dead. In other words, the resurrection of the dead is a reasonable expectation. Okay, so he gives his background, and then not only that, he's going to admit here that his past persecutions of the Christians, I verily thought with myself that I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus Christ. Okay? And so before his conversion of Christ, while he was a Pharisee, he truly thought that he was doing the right thing. But it was in the opposition of Jesus. Alright, so he wasn't acting hypocritically here. He wasn't saying, look, I follow Jesus, but I used to kill people for following Jesus. He wasn't being a hypocrite. He was just ignorant. Okay? He fully believed that he was doing the right thing. Which again shows this. And this is what people need to understand. This is why people need to study what Jesus said in Matthew 7, beginning at 21. Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall what? Enter the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father. Okay? Now, there are those who believe that they're doing the will of the Father, but they don't. Why? It's unlearned. Okay? Just like what Paul did. Alright? It's unlearned. He was killing Christians thinking he was right, but it's unlearned.
And they're doing exactly the opposite of what they're supposed to be doing.
Exactly.
There's another verse you might tie into this. I can't remember exactly. I know it's in the gospel. And it's a scary verse to me. Talk about the day of judgment when the lamb and the goats are separated. And he talks to the goats and said, you're basically saying you're gone. And they said, did we need God to do all these things in your name? These people believed that they were going to go to heaven.
Yeah.
And they
Certainly.
weren't.
Absolutely. And today, people will have a clear conscience when they obey a doctrine that's contrary to Jesus. Any doctrine that is not taught according to the Scriptures is contrary to Jesus Christ.
Luke 6, why say unto me, Lord, Lord, and do not the things that I say.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And the devil can appear as an angel. He can appear to be something that is good. There are many people who are in buildings today thinking that they are doing that which is right, but it's contrary to what Jesus has taught. Now, what matters more? That our feelings are satisfied, or the fact that we're doing what Jesus has said to do? We should always follow Christ. And true or false, there are some commands that he has that are hard for some people. And so they may want to give them false comfort in saying, well, I don't have to do this or that, or completely ignore that part of what he said. No.
Think about that in the Old Testament, makes me think that God doesn't think about it when we have clear expectations of what we need to do. And so it's almost childish for us to say, why do we know better? Once you do know better, if you have the opportunity to know better, we have the written word. There's no excuse behind what he did. Once he knew what he was supposed to do, I was all about it.
Absolutely. And he called himself the worst sinner of all sinners, for sure. Absolutely. Very good. Yes, they don't look it up for themselves. In fact, we have an example in the book of Acts about the noble Bereans. What did they do?
They search out the things.
They searched the Scriptures to see what Paul was saying were so. Okay.
I mean, a lot of ways it talks to you get Timothy some due diligence and daily reading in connection to a verse, and those who don't give attention to the word can be cast to and from.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Give diligence to daily reading. That was the sermon last week. And I want to charge you and beg you and plead with you to please search the Scriptures that what I'm preaching are so. Okay. We don't take my word for it. Please don't take my word for it. Even if it's not my intention, I could lead you astray just by making a mistake. Okay. And if you search the Scriptures and something I say is off or contrary, I hope you would tell me and let me know. Not be ugly about it. Just just say, hey, this is. Let's discuss this, and I'll be glad to do that for sure. Our aim is to always do what's right, not to be right, but to do what's right. What's the difference there? Yeah, pride and I know I'm right. I won the argument, but I don't care about that, man. That has nothing to do with it. It's searching the scriptures to make sure they're right. But I love chapter 26 of Acts. I'm telling you, there's going to be a lot to pull out here. Okay, so he was clearly sinning. He did it ignorantly, which made his conscience clear, but it did not remove his guilt. Okay, it did not remove. He was still in sin, and so again, if anybody teaches a false religion or teaches falsely, it is also sin, and they can have a good conscience about it, but their soul is still condemned. Okay, so therefore, that's why it's very vital that we don't support or we find a way in a loving way to tell others, I'm glad that you have an interest in Jesus. That really makes my soul happy. But let's look what the scriptures say about a certain situation, right? Okay, and so there's that, and when I was a kid, when I was a boy, at age 5 or 6, I asked Jesus into my heart. Okay, that's what I was taught. And, as a boy, kids will always want to do right. And there's a reason why Jesus says he converted this little child. It's the sweetest, most innocent thing. But again, could kids not be taught, or could kids be taught incorrectly?
They could be influenced.
Yeah, influence for sure.
I mean, as you said, they do things to be pleased. And I'm going to kind of give you a story behind that. I was raised Mormon, okay? And I remember one time going to church and everybody had these neat little rings that you wear on your right hand, said CTR. That means choose the right. I wanted one. So I was brought in before the bishop, and I was told what I had to do, and I became baptized that day. Like for that CTR ring.
You just wanted that ring that had the initials on it. Yeah, well, there you go. And I understand that. But also, I've known people to leave the church because there's something that they're wanting here on earth, and they're willing to convert out of the church in order to obtain that. Yeah, exactly. I think I've mentioned her before. I can't remember her name, but there was a girl that I knew at Munford where I was, and she was single. But she met a guy, she met a fella, and really liked him, and started going to church with him. And I don't know what her intentions were. I don't know if she tried to convert him, but what had happened, she left the church, and now she's a full-time whatever he was. Okay? And it's all for things. It's influence. It's all those things. There's different motives behind these things for sure. But rest assured, if we follow or practice or we support, we're not even supposed to support it, we're not supposed to bid Godspeed, any of those things, and then we're guilty. Our souls will be condemned. So that's why we have to be in love and teach the truth in these things and practice the truth.
We can look back in history, in the Bible, and see what happened with God's people. Started with other religions and other faiths and things, nations.
Absolutely.
They fell away.
They did fall away, and they were punished for it, and heavily. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist kind of deal.
But names are still here today.
Tenfold, for sure. Absolutely. Good thoughts. All right, verse 10. And here we go. He says, which thing I also did in Jerusalem. And many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priest. And when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them. He did some intense work for the cause of the Pharisees. They're the ones that are accusing me. I used to be one of them. Verse 11, and I punished them oft in every synagogue. And here's what gets me. Compelled them to do what? Y'all know what that means? I'd rather be put in prison or killed before doing that. Why? If I denounce Christ, I've lost everything. Not just my body, I lost my soul. Okay? That teaches me that, or tells me that his persecution was so heavy that the Christians that he captured were in fact willing to save themselves or even their families to denounce Christ.
If it happens today, I mean, when the rubber meets the road, what would you really do?
Certainly, we can easily say it. I will die for Jesus Christ. But then someone will persecute or this. I mean, is it not happening in the Middle East? Is it not happening here? It's happening on American soil too. It certainly is. For a whole lot less, yeah. Very good point. Very good point. You know, I think I mentioned this Wednesday. I don't know. I remember seeing it, reading it, whatever. I read on Twitter that that a Buddhist priest denounced homosexuality, but there was no persecution, no outcry against the Buddhist priest. Muslims also denounce it. Hinduism, all the religions denounce it. No press, no anti-rebellion, no any of this thing. But when a Christian denounces it, now there's a problem. Now there's a problem. I just read recently that a landlord was fined $675,000 because he refused to rent to a business where the owners were Muslim. That man was fined $675,000. The laws are constantly against Christianity. If that was a Muslim who denied someone else, would the same judgment happen? If a homosexual couple went to a cake factory owned by Muslims or any other religion that denounces it and they got denied, would the same judgment happen towards them? It's Christianity. It has nothing to do with what they denounce. It's simply Christianity. It's Christians who are being persecuted. Friends, it's happening. It's happening. And it could be the church's fault in general. We didn't stand up for it. We didn't stand up and fight. We were content, and we just let things go. That's why we can't be content. We have to stand up for things that are right. So now we have people who are in office who now have power to make such judgments, to make such laws, and if we're not careful, if we don't start right now doing things. Now in the state of Tennessee, we can't control what Minnesota puts in their office, but it can happen here, yes or no? Certainly so. Nashville is probably the fastest growing city in the country. Very liberal. Very, very liberal. It's getting worse. So, Nashville, with all these people who are moving from New York to escape the taxes, ironically are going to vote for the liberals in to do the same exact thing. You know, it's happening to Christians. It's happening everywhere. So we are being persecuted for sure, but we can't just sit there and take it. All right, we've got to stand up. We got to. When the Lord's on our side, so why should we be afraid, right? Okay. But anyway, this is what he was doing. He compelled them to blaspheme, to denounce Christ. Many will do that just to keep their jobs or maybe get paid or whatnot. Can't do it, regardless. Okay. And so he strove them to blaspheme and to revile Christ and whatever that is. He wreaked havoc on the church. Paul did this, the worst enemy of Christianity, but he becomes the best man in Christianity. That's another lesson about the power of God, right? The worst of the worst can become the best of the best through the gospel message. Okay, now this is where it's going to get, and we're almost out of time, but we'll read a little bit and we'll probably rehash it out next week, Lord willing. But this is where he's going to come to his conversion. Okay, talked about his background. He talked about what he did to the church. Now he's about to talk about what happened and why he's changing his ways. Okay? So verse 12, whereupon, as I went to Damascus with authority and commission from the chief priest, at midday, O king, at midday, I saw in the way a light from heaven. Midday, that's when the brightest, the day is at its brightest. The sun is shining its brightness, and still at midday, an even brighter light comes to Paul. And I saw in the way a light from heaven above the brightness of the sun, shining round about me and them which journeyed with me. And when we were all fallen to the earth, I heard a voice speaking unto me and saying in the Hebrew tongue. Okay, remember the others said they didn't hear anything. They did. They just didn't understand what they heard. Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And so a brighter light comes in the middle of the day. And I love what Jesus does here, because that says a lot about his church. Was he beating Jesus Christ? Physically? Was it Jesus Christ that they compelled to blaspheme or put in prison or even killed? Physically, no, because Jesus had already resurrected and he had ascended up into heaven on the right hand of the Father. But what did he ask? Why are you persecuting? What pronoun did he use? Me. That says a lot about his church, friends. And that should say a lot about how we should feel about this church. I'm not talking about Fairview specifically. Fairview is a member of which we are. But the church in general, that's why we need to get up and fight and not be content. Well, it doesn't affect me. They can do whatever they want. Well, it is starting to affect us, isn't it? Absolutely. Those rulings in the court, friends, that's tyranny. And if it rules against them, that means we have to apply go abide by those same laws. It does affect us, doesn't it? So I'm going to stop right there, because I think that's a good place to stop, and we'll get a little bit more into it, Lord willing, next week. Thank you so much for your time.